Welcome to the show. Can you defend marriage without reference to religion, divine revelation, God's word? Is there something about nature, something about the family and about marriage that you can defend without reference to something transcendent? Well, the answer is yes, and our guest, Father Sebastian Walshe, has a magnificent new book on understanding marriage right here on The Patrick Coffin Show. Subscribe to this channel. Don't look around for the content. Let it come to you. Hit the notification bell, and don't miss a thing. This episode of the show is brought to you by MyPillow. My name, Patrick, at the coupon code checkout gets you a massive Patrick Coffin Show discount. Go to mypillow.com. It's not just pillows, which I adore and use every night. They also have travel pillows that I take on the airplane and hotel rooms. It's also sheets, it's towels, everything, soup to nuts. I'm proud to have interviewed Mike Lindell, the CEO, former crack addict, now amazing businessman and patriot over at MyPillow. So mypillow.com, my name Patrick, gets you a massive discount. Check it out, 2 for 1, many more goodies, including access to Mike's book called it's called What Are the Odds? Great book. The subject of our previous interview, by the way, on The Patrick Coffin Show. As promised, my good friend Father Sebastian Walshe is here. He's a canon with the Norbertines in the St. Michael Abbey in El Toro, California. He is now the author of a passel of new books. This is called Understanding Marriage and Family, A Catholic Perspective. Father, amazing book. Full disclosure, I did endorse this book. You were kind enough to send me a manuscript, so thanks for writing it. Extremely important book and very timely. Why that topic?
Well, about 5 years ago, I started teaching a senior religion class at our high school. And that class was basically devoted to apologetics and some patristics as well. And what I found out was that the apologetic battlefront that needed to be fought was no longer about, Protestants and Catholics or, Jehovah's Witnesses or things like that. The battlefront was about marriage and family. And I noticed that the students in my class felt helpless in the face of the different objections to marriage and family. And so I thought to myself, well, they need help, and I need to put something together so that so my students will really be able to understand just from their human experience of the world, right? Not based, as you said, upon, some special revelation or some special cultural insight or something like that, but rather just from the common experiences that everyone has in the world, like the fact that you need a man and a woman to beget children, the fact that men and women are naturally inclined to care for their own children and to raise their own children. Those kind of fundamental facts of reality are the basis for understanding the traditional definitions of marriage and family. And so I put this book together as a kind of a course for these high school students. After 5 years of teaching it, I found that every single year it was wildly successful. The kids still to this day send me emails, write me, call me to thank me for helping them out in that class. So that's how the book originated. It was really for the sake of helping young people understand and navigate the problems around marriage and family.
Since you're a practicing Thomist and a practicing Catholic, let's start with some
observance, I might add.
What's that?
Of the strict observance, I might add.
Of the strict observance, yes. Good caveat. That should go on someone's business card, I think. Let's make some distinctions and lay a foundation of definition. I think a lot of conservatives and like-minded Christians fall into a trap when they start allowing the bifurcation between real marriage or traditional marriage over here and that other kind of the bad marriage, the lavender, the so-called gay marriage or same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Why is it important to know what marriage is without the adjective, let's call it the adjectification of the argument? Marriage is marriage, right? A zebra is a zebra, a camel's a camel, a thoroughbred is a thoroughbred.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We have words and words have meanings, okay? And you can't escape that. And one of the ways that people try to change people's minds unknowingly is by inserting a new meaning of a word while using the same name, even though it's not the same thing. It's called the fallacy of equivocation. And there are lots of examples of that in history, both in theology and philosophy. Right now,
like
for
what?
example, right now, for example, there's an attempt to redefine the word man. Right? It used to be that man means rational animal, so it referred to both the male and the female of our species. And now they're trying to restrict man to refer only to the male of our species, which then causes all these problems because, for example, when our Declaration of Independence says something like all men are created equal, it says, see, it's sexist. They don't think that women are equal to men or whatever.
Right.
Huh? So this attempt to redefine terms in such a way that people can no longer understand what people used to mean, and then they assume that people in their previous usage of those words were being unjust or unfair or whatever. So this has happened with regard to marriage, right? We've got a traditional definition of marriage, and then people have tried to slip in a new definition of marriage and then pretend like we've always been using that new definition, right? So if you wanted to sort of set the two side by side, I think it's a good time to just say, what is marriage in the traditional sense? In the traditional sense, marriage is a lifelong communion of a man and a woman established by their free consent for the sake of the generation and the education of children. That's what marriage always meant.
Until death do them part.
Yeah, lifelong communion. It's for the rest, it's for their life. And the new definition of marriage is something like this: a legal contract between two or even more persons, apparently, right, which is for the sake of romantic love or sexual emotional fulfillment. And those are not the same reality. They're not even close to the same reality, right? There's so many fundamental differences between those two definitions that it would be wrong to try and give them the same name. So throughout the book, I've refused to refer to same-sex marriage because marriage doesn't fit that description. I'll talk about same-sex contracts or something like that because it's a legal construction. It's not something that originates spontaneously from human nature. So that's very important. One way to plant a seed is to go full metal Socratic and ask someone who would like to see marriage redefined what argument they might put forth to forbid the marriage of two adult male siblings. Yes. And they usually scrunch their face and they say, oh, that's gross. No, wait a second. I'm going off your definition. Yes. What argument can you bring to forbid that? And isn't that narrow and ultimately bigoted? Yes. I don't think there's an answer for the objection. Or for that matter, as many people as you want. Because if the purpose, as stated in the new definition of marriage, if the purpose is romantic interest or just sexual pleasure or fulfillment, well, there's simply no reason why that's restricted to two people, right? There's nothing in the definition itself that indicates that it should be between only two people or between only non-family members or any other, possible permutation. So definitions mean something.
And this is not abstract. There's a lesbian throuple in Massachusetts that wants the legal recognition. There's tens of thousands of so-called polyamorous couples in the United States that want marriage redefined to include groups. So this is, and it's hard to parody things now, right?
In Utah,
what's that?
Yeah, I heard recently that in Utah, they actually have decriminalized or took away any penalty for polygamy now in Utah. And it's predictable. It's exactly what you would expect given this new definition of marriage and family.
Can you believe how quickly the ground has kind of fallen away under our feet? I mean, this book would not have been needed 10 years ago.
That's right. Yeah. I guess I can believe how quickly it's happened because of the fact that we've been working on this false definition of marriage for about 25 years now. I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine. I used to work at an intellectual property law firm, and I was talking to one of the attorneys there. And I said, if you the argument for contraception, eventually you're going to grant the argument for gay unions and making them equivalent to marriage. And he laughed at me at the time. He said, that's not possible. This is about 25 years ago. And I said, look, think about it. What's the new meaning of marriage if you accept contraception as a legitimate means of regulating birth, because basically you're saying that marriage isn't about the generation of children. It's about the pleasure or the romantic feelings that you have. And therefore, there's no reason to restrict marriage anymore to a man and a woman, or one man and one woman. And
Right.
so he thought it was unbelievable. Years later, I ran into him a few years ago, and he said, "I am sorry I did not believe you then." So I just have consequences. And that's why I wrote this book, to put the right ideas back into people's minds so that they would be in a position to defend themselves and understand themselves what they're dealing with.
One wonders if the phrasing of the encyclical Humanae Vitae, that subject of my first book, The Contraception Deception, I wonder if Paul VI had more closely hewed to the traditional understanding of marriage as being tied first to procreation, the primary end, not the sole end, and not even the subjectively noisiest end, but the primary end from a metaphysical point of view. Because now I think that definition was somewhat flattened by the way he described it in Humanae Vitae, such that although it affirms the biblical norm and forbids contraception, it's some dissenters will find a kind of chink in the armor there, and they'll say, "See, it's procreative and unitive," and sometimes you want to fulfill the unitive meaning and sometimes the procreative meaning. That doesn't mean that every single sex act has to be free of contraception. Do you see what I'm getting at with the phraseologies?
I do. And I remember in 1944, the Holy Office under Pius XII came out with a statement that says that the generation of children is a primary end of marriage, and the unitive is ordered to that. And I think if Paul VI had been clearer about that, we would have saved at least some problems in the church itself. I remember attending a conference given by a very devout sister who was, she was certainly considered herself very orthodox. She was following John Paul II. And in her talk, she talked about these co-equal ends of the unitive and the procreative as if there was no relation between them. And I remember at the time raising the objection. I said, that's not intelligible, right? Something can't have two proper ends. A washcloth can't simultaneously be for the sake of drying something and also for use as an anchor or something like that. They have to be, there has to be a proper and proximate end for each thing that tells you what it is. And so to say that marriage has these two co-equal ends which are unrelated to each other ends up implicitly denying the nature of marriage itself.
I wonder if there's an analogy to something else that we can, because it gets abstract rather quickly to say, procreation and education is the primary end. I believe it was Scott Hahn gave a talk 20 or 30 years ago, and he analogizes eating. The primary end of eating is nutrition and the sustenance of the body.
That's right.
But if you were on a desert island and there was nothing else to eat but, dead whatever, you would do it, even though it didn't taste good, because of that primary end. And then, of course, in that analogy, contraception would be eating, which apparently serves the end of nutrition, but then putting a spoon down one's throat to I hope people aren't eating, vomit out the food you just ate. I'm getting hungry. So I think that's that analogy, I think, is clear for most people. Yeah.
No, I think so. It's funny because for the most part, we'll admit everything with regard to all the other bodily organs and functions. So if I tell you eyes are for seeing and ears are for hearing, everyone says absolutely right. And I say, well, let me try and drink with my eyes. Okay, that doesn't work. And let me try and eat with my ears. No, that's not going to work, right? People admit that. But as soon as you get down to the reproductive organs, all the other organs, eyes are for seeing, ears are for hearing, digestive tracts are for digesting, and then you get to reproductive organs, and suddenly it's the unitive purpose. And that's not the lesson nature teaches us, right? If one thing you learn as a priest over many, many years watching people's lives, the closer you stick to following nature, the happier people are. It's you're made a certain way by God, and that's intelligible to anyone who, regardless if they have faith or not, if they have working senses. You can ask a 6-year-old in Cambodia, or a 5-year-old in Southern Sahara, what your eyes are for and what your ears are for, and they can tell you. And in the same way, any reasonable adult can tell you, well, I know what my reproductive organs are for. They've got a purpose, and that purpose is for the generation of new life. And if we use them that way, what we find is that we have peace in our own souls, happiness in our married life, and our children end up being happy and well-adjusted as a result. So,
how much do you think, Father Sebastian, have the artifices of modern life put us into a state of alienation? Very few people walk around barefoot in the grass. And steadily increasing number of us, put the other way, there's a decreasing number of farmers, say. Things are much more technologically run. I forget which poet said, one is closer to God's heart in a garden. Well, nowadays we live in concrete jungles. We're carried around on things called cars. We don't have that connection with the land, with cause effect as it's seen in nature. How much do you think of our technocratic concrete glass world has further blinded us to our connection with nature?
I'm very much in agreement with that statement. I read some statistic, and I wish I could repeat it exactly right, but it was something like this, that people who live in rural environments are something like 4 or 8 times less likely to develop same-sex attraction, whereas those who live in urban environments are 4 or 8 times more likely. That already tells you something. If you're living in a rural environment, if you're surrounded by nature, if you see nature working, right, your nature responds. You know what I mean? And when you're constantly surrounded by technology so that you barely ever see natural things, and that includes, especially now recently, right, the constant use of the internet by young people. I've already run into a few cases of young people who are suffering from gender dysphoria. In every single case, the common denominator is they spend all their time on the internet. It's an interesting, just fact I've noticed in the cases now of those who have gender dysphoria. So I think this divorce from the natural world ends up also being a divorce from our own nature. And so an incapacity to really appreciate the natural order within us and to love and desire to act in accordance with our own natures.
Yeah, it's interesting that the internet, while it's enabled a global village with this unspeakable, massive amount of interconnectivity, it's also an echo chamber. If you read anything by René Girard, we're naturally imitative people. We want to be like the people we're surrounded with. So if you're going on certain websites that promote an agenda that's against the human person, or assumes that gender dysphoria, even that phrase sounds a little bit moralistic. Ooh, dysphoria, like there's a problem with it. The more you imbibe that notion, the more you're going to be likely to break down your natural reserves against it. And it's harder to go against the grain. Parents understand the importance of peer pressure. You want your kid embedded in 5 other virtue-seeking kids, not the ones that are from the wrong side of the tracks or who are going to indulge in drugs and other bad behaviors.
Yeah, St. Paul said, bad company corrupts good morals, and we have a natural inclination to be like those around us. That's really true. So, the internet can be a place of great danger then for young people, especially young people who feel unsatisfied in their own connections in their own family. Then they obviously go outside to look elsewhere, and when they look elsewhere, they often find things that end up being more poisonous for them than helpful.
Can we go back to your original definition of marriage? Can you review that one more time?
Yeah, so it's a lifelong communion between a man and a woman, established by their free consent for the sake of the generation and the education of children. See, you look at that definition. Go ahead.
Well, that's not the definition that one typically hears at a wedding homily, or in a something that's given on a retreat for engaged couples.
Yeah.
The unitive, romantic, feelings-based model dominates to I don't know what kind of factor. Do you think that feeds into the divorce rate even among Catholics? This idea of marriage as feeling journey, marriage as basically it's narcissistic. It's basically the good feelings my partner gives for me, that's our marriage. And when feelings stop, and all feelings stop, you're not going to have a 50-year-long marriage filled with the heart-pounding, romantic, divine candy of the honeymoon. And that's when problems start, because it's jarring to be annoyed or even angry at your spouse because he or she's a sinner.
Yeah. No, absolutely. When you start with this idea of marriage equals romantic love, when that's your starting point, then the marriage is going to be over pretty quick. The marriage will be over pretty quick. One of the things I tell spouses or couples before I marry them, when I do marriage prep, I say two things. I say, first of all, exactly what are you promising to your spouse when you get married? And number two, don't make this one mistake. So the first thing I say is, what is it that you're promising? You're promising to your spouse the exclusive right over one another's bodies for the acts that are apt to generate children. That exact promise makes you married. It's a very objective promise. It has to do with the act of reproduction, and everything else follows from that. If you're going to have children with someone, of course you should love them. Of course you should live together. Of course you should raise the children together. But none of those other things makes you married. A brother and a sister could raise the children of their deceased sibling together, and that wouldn't make them married, right? What makes them married is that agreement about exclusive acts apt to generate children. Marriage is about the continuation of our species and the proper context in which children should be raised by their own father and their own mother. So that's the first thing, knowing the right object of marital consent. And no young person has yet been able to answer that question for me when I prepared them for marriage. I've done dozens and dozens of marriages, and every single time I ask them, what are you promising each other when you get married? And they say, we're promising to love each other for the rest of our lives. And I said, well, it's true that you should love each other for the rest of your lives, but that's not going to make you married. David and Jonathan promised to marry each other, to love each other for the rest of their lives, but they're not married, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing I tell them is, if you think your spouse will make you happy, you will be divorced quickly. The truth of the matter is that God has made us for himself. And it's like trying to get blood out of a turnip to expect happiness from your spouse, right? Each of you is supposed to be a window to the heart of Christ. Each of you is supposed to be leading the other to Christ as their happiness, rather than to try and be the object of their happiness. And as long as you think your spouse is going to make you happy, then you'll be inevitably disappointed. And then, of course, you'll think your marriage was a failure because your spouse didn't make you happy. Whereas if you think, well, no, my marriage was for bringing children into the world and trying to give them a context to be raised and brought to God, then that makes it more sensible and you can get through the hard times.
I heard a homily once where the permanent deacon, as it turns out, was talking about the three rings of marriage, the engagement ring and the wedding ring and the suffer ring. And no one ever wants to talk about the third ring. Marriage is tough. It's hard to, if you think of it as the union, the lifelong union of everything you said, of two sinners.
Yes.
Which is why Bishop Sheen's book is called Three to Get Married, right? Christ, the bridegroom, husband and wife.
Yeah, there's no way to stay married in the modern world without the grace of Christ. It's just, even marriage is something natural, falls away and decays in the midst of a sinful world overcome by original sin, unless you have that supernatural support from within that comes from a selfless love in Jesus Christ.
What do you make of the movement at all levels of the church, it seems, to fast track the annulment process? Yeah.
Well, I have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, I honestly believe there's more reason objectively for annulments than there've ever been, because the misinformation about the nature of marriage is so vast. As I said before, most young people have no idea what they're actually promising when they get married. So from that perspective, I really believe culturally we have so much ignorance about the nature of marriage that it seems likely to me that many marriages, in fact, are annullable that weren't maybe a generation or two ago. So on the one hand, I really believe that's the case. On the other hand, I don't think the solution is to fast track annulment processes. I think the solution is the proper education, spouses before they get married, and that's where the church should really be focusing its efforts. And I'm concerned that the church is still constantly just stuck in this rut of repeating over and over again, well, marriage is about the inseparability of the unitive and procreative, and let's just not ask any questions about that. I think young people deserve better, and they need to see that marriage is not only something supernatural, but also something founded in our nature. And until they see the connection between human nature, human flourishing, and marriage, they're always going to see marriage as some kind of an obstacle to their happiness, when it becomes difficult. So
there's a Canadian Scarborough Foreign Mission priest who died in 1995 named Father John McGoey. I was privileged to know him. He was sort of a spiritual director of mine when I was living in Toronto. And he ran the marriage preparation course in the Archdiocese of Toronto for 40 years. And he likened marriage to the major leagues. And so when groups of engaged couples came in, he would tell them in the first night, my goal is to break you up. I want to break up as many of you as I can. I'm going to kick your tires because I'm going to drill down into why you're doing this and what's the nature of the commitment you're about to make. And, some dropped out. They just didn't want to hear that at all. And he's like, okay, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Better to have the tires kicked and to see the flaws now before you even pronounce vows. And God forbid children come along. Right?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. And and of course, there's the other thing that you're wrestling with or struggling with is the fact that many of the young people who are getting married today came themselves from problematic families. So they can't even fall back on the example of their own parents to figure this out. Even if sometimes if you've got bad ideas in your head, at least you can just look at the example of your parents. They came happy, healthy marriage. And you're like, well, I don't know about all these weird ideas, but mom and dad did it right, so I'll do that. But when you don't have either one of those, it can be really rough, for young people.
You just stole one of my arrows from my quiver, moving from marriage. It's okay. It's a sign of things going right. Segueing from marriage to family, as more and more marriages stop lasting long term, you have an increasing number of young people. And it sounds to me that since then Governor Ronald Reagan gave us the first no-fault divorce law in 1969 in California, of course that spread across the country, something that President Reagan said that he regretted very much. Now we're onto our second generation of the children of divorce and the normalization of divorce. And the problem, I wish there was a magic wand to make it all stop, but there isn't. Except for couples themselves being called to heroically unite in patience, in kindness, in willing to work things out. And yes, I think for the sake of the kids is a just reason to continue. Yes. People poo-poo that.
I have a saying. I like to say, in a world full of broken legs, it's important that there be casts. It sometimes happens that people think that the problem with their marriage is because it's causing them pain. And so they think, I'm in pain in my marriage, and therefore I should stop being married because the problem is the marriage. And that's a lot like someone saying, it hurts to eat when I have a toothache, so the problem is that I'm eating, right? No, the truth of the matter is, eating is good for human nature. It's necessary for human nature.
Yep.
Eating is a tooth, a bad tooth, and that needs to be addressed. Similarly, marriage is not the problem, and therefore divorce is not the solution, right? Marriage is protective of human nature. It's good for you. And therefore, the real problem that needs to be addressed is a lack of virtue in one or both spouses. And that can involve separation for a time, where each spouse works on their own problems. Sometimes they can't work on their problems when they're living together, but that doesn't mean you're free to remarry and start a new family or something like that, right? Marriage really is good for you, and until we recognize that marriage is good for you, you will think that the solution is divorce, but it's not. So,
what are some behaviors that are lethal to marriage or that attack marriage? Let's start with sexual behaviors not ordered to generation of new life.
Yes.
With the pornification of our culture and with the confusion about the church's teaching on contraception, I'm sure there's a whole new default assumption that some sexual behaviors having nothing to do with babies are totally fine.
Yes. Well, since that's the very root of your marriage, in other words, you promise the object of your consent is exclusive right over your body for acts apt to generate children. Any kind of misuse of that reproductive power, either with your spouse or without your spouse, right? Obviously, adultery is the clearest where you're using your reproductive power with someone other than your spouse. But even using contraception with your spouse is deadly for a marriage. And it's no surprise that the highest statistical correlation between divorce and any other factor is contraception. Different studies have shown in different things, but it's something like you're 20 times more likely to get divorced if you use contraception. Whereas,
think about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Just the definition, the word itself, contraception, against the beginning.
Yes.
You are attacking your spouse as the symbolic partner in the adventure of parenthood.
Yes. So here you are at the time when you're supposed to be most intimate. And what's the euphemism they use for contraception? They call it protection.
Yeah, protection.
I need protection. Well, who's your enemy? Because you need protection against an enemy. Is it your spouse who's your enemy at the time when you're supposed to be most intimate with each other? Is it your future children who are now your enemy? And how's that going to work out for your relationship with your children if you treated them as an enemy to begin with and they're an accident or something, right? So that whole idea of contraception and protection shows very clearly how you're not living a relationship which is truly a communion while you're using contraception. It's just not possible.
That's the very act where we get the phrase, the two shall become one.
Yes.
And that becomes literally true in the person of the child.
That's right. Yeah.
So let's move to the more lofty, it's one of my favorite topics, how the Blessed Trinity as a dogma is reflected in the two in one flesh union of husband and wife. It's beautifully set in your book here.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So look, we have the mysteries of the faith revealed to us, and very often what happens is that Catholics say to me, they say, I can be a perfectly good Catholic on the one hand and believe all the things we're supposed to believe. I believe in the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Eucharist. And at the same time, I can deny all these things that the church is saying about marriage and family. They think there's no connection between the mysteries of the faith and the mystery of the sacrament of matrimony, right? They think there's no connection. But then I ask them, well, in terms of what do we express the mystery of the Trinity, right? We call God a Father. And we say he's got an eternally begotten Son. So there you have Father, Son, begetting, right? Those all sound a lot like marriage and family terms, don't they?
Yeah.
So the very primary mystery in terms of which Christ revealed his relationship with his Father and our relationship with God is in terms of a family. And that extends even to the Incarnation. When we say the union of the human and the divine, St. Paul says this is a great mystery. Right? The husband and the wife are a sacrament of the union of the human and the divine, the relationship of God to man, both in the church, between Christ and his church, and in the Incarnation itself, the divinity and the humanity in Christ. And so here, the fundamental mysteries of our faith are inexorably bound up with the truths and the relationships within the human family. If young people do not see the value and the goodness of the relationships within the family and within marriage, then the door to heaven will be closed. The window to heaven will be shut, and they will no longer be able to see what it means to have a Father in heaven, or to say that he's got an eternally begotten Son, or to say that a husband and a wife are an image of the union of God and man. All those things will, practically speaking, become meaningless because we don't have the right experience. Imagine a young child who comes raised without even knowing a father, never having their own father, for example.
So the notion of me first, which characterizes contraception, would be lethal to the Trinity. The Trinity would implode in a nanosecond if there was the slightest note of withholding of self.
Yeah. Imagine God begetting his son, but just sort of like, withholding his power of generation when he begot his son. I mean, the act by which a man begets in his wife a new life is supposed to be an image of the act by which God begets new believers in and through the church. And then how do we experience that if we think of ourselves in a completely contraceptive culture, where we think of our parents as just kind of not really wanting us, or the act of begetting as being something intrinsically made infertile,
Yeah.
So,
yeah. In my book, I apply this to Christ on the cross. And what would contraception look like if our Lord had a contraceptive mentality? And I think it would be him pretending to die.
Yeah.
Him making his heart stop momentarily and giving the appearance of death. But really, he would be defrauding his bride because his death would not be sacrificial, because it wouldn't be a death. It would be,
that's right.
A fake snooze.
Yeah, he will not have given forth his spirit. Yeah, That's right. So, I really do think that there's I think C.S. Lewis in God in the Dock, he mentioned this, I quoted in my book. He says that male and female and the act of reproduction, those are supposed to be signs of supernatural realities, and we can't just mess around with them like as if they were just artificial constructs. And what's happened in our society is once you consider marriage to be an artificial construct, something created by the state, all the relationships in a family suddenly become completely subject to the authority of the state, and it becomes a kind of a tyranny. And you're getting these crazy things. I don't know if you've read any of them. There was a anti-homeschooling Congress in Harvard where they actually said that a lot of the participants expressly stated parents only have authority over their children because of the delegation of the state. The state gives them authority, and your children belong to the state. Astounding, right? But these are the sort of consequences that come when you think marriage is a construct of the state instead of something natural and supernatural made by God.
Yes, and now you have a growing passel of celebrities. Anderson Cooper comes to mind. Homosexual couples who manage to adopt a baby. How'd the baby come to be? No one talks about that.
Yeah.
And this is so, I think, because of the flip side of the church's teaching. Just maybe we can linger on this for a moment. Not only does the church say that babies are a necessary component to sexual congress, at least in potential, the flip side is also true, that babies must not come into being going around God's chosen design.
Yes.
Even though, you can have a baby conceived through in vitro fertilization that has nothing to do with the dignity of the child. The child's obviously as loved by God and should be welcomed into the world once existent, for the same reason that someone who is conceived of rape is just as lovable and loved by God. But talk a little bit about how planned parenthood in the form of, see what I did there, in the form of reproductive technologies is also part of this problem. Well,
again, what happens now when you've got these reproductive technologies? What you have is you've got at least a third agent who's now inserted themselves into the generative process. And now children are not begotten in love, they're made by a lab technician, And how's that going to be a sign or a sacrament of God's love for us and our being begotten in love by our Father in heaven, right? We'll tend to think of ourselves as products of conception, right? And we were made as useful for our parents. Our parents looked at us and said, well, I want a kid, and that kid is a useful good for me, not something that comes about as a result of human nature, not a gift from God, right? Not something begotten in love, but rather something useful for me. I want to have a toy to play with, and someone to make sure they take care of me when I get old. And at the same time, you're just something I made. You're a product that I produced. And to treat human beings that way is a horrible thing to do. Human beings deserve better than that.
It's a whole community called Anonymous Us, made up of people whose sperm vendors are unknown to them. I don't say donor because they're always paid. We should call them sperm vendors.
Yeah, I agree. So
all right, let's go ahead.
No, I was just simply, adding that the fact that nature again is supposed to be a sacrament of supernature, and the more we separate ourselves from the natural order. I mean, Jesus, when he gave his parables, when he talked, almost always he was describing the things of heaven in terms of the things of earth. He said to Nicodemus, "If you do not understand the things of earth, how will you understand the things of heaven?" And even Moses was shown the pattern below in terms of the earthly tabernacle to see the heavenly pattern, right? The heavenly reality that it was supposed to be a symbol or a sign of. And so the farther we divorce ourselves from the natural order, especially with regard to family, marriage, reproduction, male, female, to that extent, we've closed the door to heaven and we're blind to the love of our Father in heaven and to all the beautiful things in heaven that we're destined for.
Let's talk about the things we're destined for on earth, and that is you close with marks of healthy, flourishing Christian families.
Yes.
So it's very easy because there's so many examples abounding of bad examples to avoid. But what are some behaviors that model a flourishing Christian family? What does it look like?
So first, you need to have integrity. And what that means is that you have to have all the members of the family should be present and active together, right? So the family shouldn't be marred by divorce. The parents and children should be together and should share one another's lives, And so children, for example, shouldn't be constantly gone and away. There should, I always recommend that there be at least one meal each day that the family's all together and they're active. So that's integrity. The second mark is communion. And communion means a sharing of life. Unity is a multitude of people where they're aiming for some common goal. But a communion is where a multitude of persons share a life together. And that means there's mutual knowledge and love. And it's deep knowledge, the knowledge of each other's faults and problems, and still a choice to love someone with their problems. So you need communion within a family, right? Then the third mark is order and harmony. And that means that there should be clear lines of authority, that the children should respect the parents, they should obey the parents and honor them. At the same time, the parents should have the right love and relationship with each other, right? The husband should not treat his wife like a child, but rather as an equal, right? And nevertheless, right, when it comes down to making a decision that bears in the whole unity of the family, if it's necessary, the husband's able to make a final decision so as to preserve the unity of the family after reasonable discussion. So there needs to be that order and harmony. Then you should have begetting of new life. A family is healthy when it begets new life. Aristotle says the good is diffusive of itself, and a happy, healthy family will want to share its happiness and its love with others. And then finally, the last mark of a healthy family is striving beyond the natural to the supernatural. It's not enough to have just the supernatural good. Sometimes I've seen these very traditional Catholic families where everyone's perfectly kneeling and bolt upright, and the girls have the chapel veils on, and there's no affection between mom and dad. Dad has a drinking problem, or mom has a drinking problem or whatever, and there's no real natural love there. So you have the supernatural without the natural, but grace builds on nature there. And on the other hand, sometimes you have families, it's almost like they're a pagan paragon, and they have all the natural virtues, but they never do things like say a family rosary together or go to mass together. So striving beyond the natural to the supernatural is probably the best mark of a flourishing Christian family.
Another example of the both and, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The golden thread. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you at the Restore the Culture Conference in Newport Beach
Thank you.
April 30th, May 1st, 2021. This is a really nice foretaste of the things that you'll be sharing there. And I'm also looking forward, maybe we can connect again, Keeping Your Kids Catholic, published by an outfit called Catholic Answers.
Yeah.
Another much needed book.
Yes.
So, well, that was a fast hour and 4 minutes, Father Sebastian, as always.
Thank you, Patrick. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And I remember so fondly all of our interviews way back when on Catholic Answers. It's really nice to get back together with you.
Yep. Amen. Absolutely. The book we're talking about today, highly recommended. You can pick up a copy at patrickcoffin.media. Understanding Marriage and Family, A Catholic Perspective, published by Aruka Press. Boy, with the exception of little old me, you've got some great endorsers, Bishop James Wall, Bishop Thomas Paprocki, Bishop Athanasius Schneider.
Yeah.
The book hits a nerve, and I hope it gets what it deserves, which is a wide readership in multiple languages, I must add.
Thank you, Patrick. God bless you.
All right. Thanks for your priesthood. Can I get a priestly blessing on our staff and our listeners around the world?
Dominus vobiscum, et cum spiritu
tuo.
Per intercessionem Beata Maria Virginis et omnium sanctorum, benedictio Dei potentis Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti descendat super vos et maniat semper. Amen.
Amen. Great to have a blessing in our mother's native tongue. Awesome.
Amen.
All right. Thanks for everything, Father. God bless you.
You're welcome. God bless you.
This is the
Blessings to
Patrick
everyone at
Coffin
home.
Show. Amen. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.